Greetings, geologists, and today we're going to learn about geological depositional environments. You're like, wow, that's a big, big three words. Very important three words, though, for the study of geology. So I'd like to give you an example unrelated to the field of geology to kind of illustrate what we're talking about, and then we'll apply it to the various different depositional environments that you'll learn about. So I'd like you to envision Summer Olympics, and I'd like you to think about in track and field in particular. I would like you to envision the cross-country runners. Do you envision what their body looks like? Then I want you to look at the hurdle runners. Do their legs look different? Are they more muscular as opposed to being long and lean? Then I want you to think about the shot putter or the javelin thrower. How do they look different? So each body plan is still an athlete, right? But they're made a little bit differently and based on how they train. Now, while rocks don't train and fossils don't train, they are made and they live in very specific environments today. If you recall the lesson on geological principles, James Hutton, Law of Uniformitarianism, states that the present is the key to the past. So if I know how something forms today, and I find it in the rock record, meaning out in the field in a rock layer, much like I see right here, then I can theorize that that's how that rock was made in geologic past. So we're going to look at some depositional environments and some sedimentary structures and fossils that are used to help identify clues as to how that rock was made. This is all about what geology is. It's about discovering the clues, solving the mystery, and so it can be a lot of fun. Let's get to business. So again, the definition of a depositional environment is this. It's the ancient geologic environment by which a sedimentary rock and structures were made. Structures will become clear to you soon. It's all about discovering the clues. So what is this right here? Well, that kind of looks like what's called a ripple mark to me. That gives me an immediate clue as to the kind of environment that might have existed when this rock was formed. You'll find out more soon. All right, so look at this depositional environment. You're like, oh yeah, I see the fossils there. This is from the Waco Mammoth site, and this would be a terrestrial environment. I think it's important to define the two major areas of where we get fossils from. There's terrestrial environments and then there are marine environments. Terrestrial refers to everything that's on continents. So that could even be a lake, that could be a river, that could be a desert, that could be a glacial environment, that could just be open plains, or it could be right smack dab in the middle of Waco, Texas, where this mammoth site is located. Marine refers to ocean-derived environments. So that could be near shore, shoreline, that could be a lagoon, that could be the abyssal plain at the bottom of the ocean, that could be the continental shelf, the slope, that could be a mid-oceanic ridge. There's a lot of variety as to where a marine rock could be formed. So when we're talking terrestrial, we're talking about continental. Obviously, this mammoth didn't hang out swimming in the ocean, right? So he would be a terrestrial derived environment that he lived in. Here are some clues that help us discover how rocks were made and where they were made. So you're looking at some rocks from Glacier National Park. They're clearly sandstone layers. They look like pancakes, don't they? And all rocks that are sedimentary are laid into strata. And strata simply refers to rock beds or layers. And these are distinct rock layers that share some very similar characteristics. And those characteristics can be everything from when they formed to the environment by which they were formed. It can indicate climate conditions. It could indicate a source of erosional material. Let's say a mountain was weathering in the area and depositing the same types of sediments down a river basin, and this accumulated those sediments down at the bottom of the lake, at the bottom of the mountain. So, and when we're looking at a bed of layers, they share some kind of commonality. They share history together. So look at these rock layers, and I want you to focus in on this rock formation right here in Sedona, Arizona. And find this layer, and then zoom it in right here. Now, let me tell you a little bit about this. This is a unique rock layer of the Schnebly Hill Formation. Like, who do I need to know that? Not for this class, right now anyway, but what you do need to know is the Schnebly Hill is a formation name. Matter of fact, all layers in geology have a formation name. Just like you have a proper name, so does the rock layer. It's been assigned a name. And the parents are the geologists that discovered it, so they got to name the rock, right? So this is the Schnebly Hill, of which it has many members. So you have to assume that a rock formation is kind of like your family unit. The unit's made up of a series of people that live together that are in the same family, but each member is a little different, right? And so the members that make up a formation are still from the same basic history, but there may be something unique about that history, and I guarantee you there is right here. That's limestone. Limestone has no business being in the proximity of a bunch of sandstone, especially what used to be cross-bedded sandstones. You can still see a little bit of bedding here, and you'll learn about cross-beds shortly. But sandstone is indicative of either a desert or shoreline environment. Well, limestone's wide open ocean, so something's up with that, right? So what that tells me in Arizona is if I've got this big old layer of limestone sitting there, that tells me that sea level rose in Sedona for a while and then came back down because I got that shoreline rock right above it again. Wow, totally a new perspective on how to read rocks, right? So depositional environments and the structures that are in them are simply clues to help us discover how a rock was made and sometimes when a rock was made. So texture refers to, and in terms of depositional environment, texture refers to the morphology or the shape of a rock. So you remember back in sedimentary, the story I told about my friend from On the Border who wanted these rocks that were round, right? She wanted big old cobblestones. Well, rocks get round like that because they're transported, and any angular broken up edges from where they broke out of a rock layer or a rock bed, like you saw in Glacier a few minutes ago, the pancake rocks, right? They get tumbled at the bottom of a river basin and get round. Well, if I see round rocks, right away, I know that we're dealing with something that has to do with a river and river conditions. Just the opposite, if I see very angular textures, like you see by this rock hammer, it tells me that those sediments didn't have time to travel very far before they got trapped in a new rock layer. So they didn't get to run away and enjoy life for a long time. These rocks got a really good fun journey along the way before they settled down and made their new home. So this is still a very energetic environment that created it, probably a mass wasting event. Maybe a landslide, maybe a rock ball, maybe a rock slide. But nevertheless, they're just all crunched up rock that didn't have any chance to be transported. So the angular edges to that tells me that there's a story behind that rock. Crossbedding's another clue. Now this is one of my, well, it is my favorite park actually. This is Zion National Park, and my favorite side of Zion National Park actually. This is the east side of the park, and if you're going to Zion, you need to travel all the way through it because it is truly a spectacular wonder. It's one of the best kept secrets of the national park system. So what is crossbedding? First of all, crossbeds are ancient sand dunes for the most part. Now you can see crossbedding on a smaller scale in a river environment, just so you know. But basically, crossbeds help us determine the direction and even to a degree the speed by which ancient flow of wind and water currents occurred in an area. In the case of Zion, we're not looking at water speed or direction. We're looking at desert dunes, sand dunes. So if you could imagine this, and this is for real, I did no enhancement on this picture. This is exactly what it looked like straight out of my camera on sabbatical. This is an ancient sand dune, and it's been lithified. Remember, lithification refers to hardened? So these rocks got hardened in place, and these were big giant sand dunes back in the early Jurassic period during early dinosaur time. So how does crossbedding form. Cross-bedding forms when sand is pushed up a dune or hits a barrier like a rock, and it builds up layer upon layer until it topples down the backside. So it makes a pattern, crisscross pattern like this. And so you can determine based on the angle of the cross beds, the degree of the wind. In other words, what kind of wind patterns were there? Was it really fast? Was it fairly low winds? Was there the prevailing wind? Cross-bedding tells you a lot about the depositional environment of that area. This is another good look at some of the incredible cross-bedding in Zion National Park. I can assure you, you will never see better cross-bedding anywhere in the world as significant as Zion National Park. It's just exquisite, and it's known for it. And so when you go, you're just kind of overwhelmed by, wow, these rocks are huge. And then you get the gist, that sand had to come from somewhere. So that's another clue about cross-bedding is there had to have been some big source of sand. It didn't fall from the sky. It got weathered from probably a mountain that was nearby at that time. All right, graded beds. Graded beds simply refer to a progressive decrease in grain size as rocks are settling out in some kind of a river environment. All right, so here's your big clast right here, then your medium clast, then your small clast. Here's big, medium, small, and tiny. Matter of fact, there's a series of various different graded beds in this picture. You're like, I'm having a hard time getting it. That's what usually students tell me in face-to-face classes here. What happens is the water energy of a river flows consistently. So first things for your test, graded beds are an indicator of consistent energy environments in a depositional river environment. But more importantly, I will tell you that the heavy stuff gets dropped out first because the velocity or flow of the water just can't carry it as far as it does the lightweight material, which would be the smaller grains. So this grain right here is big. It didn't get carried as far as these little tiny grains did up here. This is a good analogy of a graded bed. You see the bigger clast here, the medium, small, and then tiny? Well, same thing's happening here. You get big, medium, small. Here's a little bit, this is medium, and then tiny. And you see a series of like, here's a graded bed, here's a graded bed, here's a graded bed. These are clues that we had consistent river environments over an extended period of time. This is a great look at a graded bed. Can you see how the grains are bigger down here and tiny up here? So if you ever see graded beds, they're indicators of very good consistent energy environments. On the flip side, if you see a rock layer where it's just an accumulation of all different sizes, like a conglomerate or a breccia, then you're looking at very inconsistent energy environments. Like you have a flood, then the movement of the water is very slow. You have a flood, it's slow. You have a flood, it's slow. So it's not consistent. And when you see graded beds, that tells you they're consistent. All right, another clue in sedimentary rocks is body fossils. So what's a body fossils? These are the actual remains of a once living animal. Well, so what's an animal? In this case, we'll kind of be a little bit more specific. It could be vertebrates, it could be invertebrates, it could be plants, it could be microfossils of bacteria. Lots of different things it could be, but fossils can come in stuff you can see without a microscope and tiny little bitty things that are just like a millionth of the size of a hair strand. Nevertheless, they all play a very important clue and role about the type of environment that that rock was formed in. For example, this is fossils that we found on our field course this past summer in Mesa Lands Community College in their dig site in the Redonda Formation. That's late Triassic in age. And these are vertebrate bones right here. You can clearly make out the bones, right? So first of all, that's a terrestrial environment. You've learned that in this lecture up until this point. And then the deposits of the rock layer also suggest it's a stream environment. And so we can take the clues that the fossils have to tell us simply by knowing what kind of animal it is and applying that to the rock layer itself. So I'll give you another example. There are fish deposits in here too, are fossils, but they're freshwater fish. You're like, well, how would you know that? Well, we can determine based on the stream deposits. We can also determine that based on bones of the fish we might find. So let me tell you how I could be sure it's not a marine environment. Sediments are one clue based on how the sediments are made, and second is the fossil itself. Let's say I find a trilobite here. Well, a trilobite is a marine animal. Now, we didn't have trilobites by the Triassic, just as an FYI, but if let's say we found them here and I find vertebrate bones here, then I might have to have a little discussion about, I wonder what kind of vertebrate that might be. What I can tell you is I will never find a marine animal in this rock layer unless somebody was playing a joke and stuck it there. I mean, they just decided to take it out there and plant it in a rock. That's just not going to happen. The reason is it wasn't the right environment for that animal to live in. Another clue in sedimentary rocks are trace fossils. These are really great clues because they're the evidence an animal or an organism was once there, but it's not the actual body fossil. For example, here's a footprint of a dinosaur. These are trilobite trails in the background. So footprints, tracks, trails, even remains of ancient fossil dung, which would be byproduct waste, for a nice way to put it. Gastroliths, which you'll learn more about in fossils. Nevertheless, these are clues of what kind of animal was there and the depositional environment by which they lived. All right, so let's get into the actual environment names and descriptions. From this point forward, you are responsible for knowing what these terms are and using them appropriately. Also, you need to know how to spell them. It matters. And I'll give you some examples as we go through here. Now, this is your classic tidal flat. Why are tidal flats important to geology? A couple of reasons. Tides come in and out on a daily basis, sometimes more than once, depending on where you live. So tidal flats are areas with usually slow-moving waters. Not always true. There is a type of tide that actually makes a very distinctive wave as it comes in during high tide areas. Nevertheless, most tidal flats have pretty slow-moving water where water kind of comes in, flows back out, and it makes some ripple marks in the mud. And as it does, those ripple marks can sometimes be preserved. Now, you're looking at an infamous fossil, by the way. These are stromatolites from Shark Bay, Australia, in Hamelin Pool. And these are the most famous stromatolites in the world. And by the way, stromatolites are extremely uncommon now, but they were the most common fossil literally about 2 billion years ago to about 1.6 billion years ago. They're certainly the oldest living fossil with a record book of about 3.8 billion years old. Now, something important. We know today all stromatolites live in very salty water. They need shallow water with enough movement of water that they can get their nutrients and photosynthesize, but they can't be overly submerged because they need enough clarity in the water to be able to utilize that sunlight to photosynthesize and make their food resource. So if I see fossilized stromatolites, I can automatically say, I bet they formed in this kind of environment right here. By the way, do you see the little ripple marks right here? So they might get preserved as future ripple marks in geologic time. So what is a ripple mark? These are ripple marks. This is a modern day tidal flat. Here's what an ancient one looks like. Ripple marks tell us that, that we had a slow moving water environment. Typically they're deposited in shales, siltstones, sometimes even sandstones. I'm standing on a ripple mark in Glacier National Park. First of all, what's the oxymoron there in Glacier National Park, right? By the way, this rock is Precambrian in age. It's about 1 billion years old. So what that tells me is Glacier used to be an environment that was like this, okay? Crazy, isn't it? But nevertheless, this tells me that Glacier had slow-moving water that was captured, and we were able to bury this rock in such a way to preserve it by some kind of fresh deposition on top of the ripple mark after it was made. All right, the second one is Aeolian. Say that with me, Aeolian. Aeolian refers to wind-derived and specifically most commonly applied to desert environments. So, from this day forward, you shall be calling deserts Aeolian environments. Predominantly in the Aeolian environment, you'll find the following rocks. You'll find Siltstones and sandstones, and then I would say on occasion maybe breccias and conglomerates, depending on flash flooding conditions that may happen in an Aeolian environment. So this refers to arid regions that don't get much rain, but when they do, the rain doesn't really have anywhere but to wash off very quickly. So you end up developing extensive mud cracks in the desert. So mud cracks are a clue when you see Aeolian environments that you've had some recent types of fluxes of water. So oftentimes you can actually get some pretty impressive conglomerates and breccia deposits that get made in a desert environment. So this is an active Aeolian environment today. I took this on my sabbatical at Death Valley National Park, and I might tell you that it's 126 degrees out here, literally, when I was taking this picture. And I can tell you it was hot. It was very hot and very dry. And that's the characteristic of an Aeolian environment. So here's what a mud crack looks like in modern day. You're like, hey, I've seen those in my yard. Sure you have, if you have clay-based soil and it rains and it shrinks. So I'm not telling you a mud crack can only form in an Aeolian environment. They form in lots of environments, but they're a clue. That's all they are, is a clue for helping us determine the kinds of wet patterns and dry patterns that happen in a region. So here's right by those ripple marks in Glacier National Park. Here are some mud cracks. Go figure, right? Like when I saw this side-by-side ripple marks and mud cracks, I was like so excited. I was like, oh, that is the coolest thing ever, because it's like a grand slam in geology to find them side by side. Great mud cracks right here. These mud cracks were actually in Death Valley National Park, and you can totally see these could get preserved, and then they would be available to see in geologic future. But if we find mud cracks like this, let's just go back one. That's what this is right here. That means that that Glacier National Park had an environment at some point probably similar to Death Valley. All right, another one is a swamp. How is a swamp different from a lagoon? There is a fundamental difference. A swamp, first of all, is on terrestrial land. So it is terrestrial land that gets somewhat flooded. So it could be brackish, meaning it has some salt water and some fresh water that mixes. So ultimately a swamp's gonna probably, if its sea level continues to rise, it'll kill off all these trees. And there are literally a variety of different swamps. Just so you know, we have some even in Waco area. The Waco wetlands is a freshwater marsh, and a marsh is a type of a swamp. Nevertheless, the type of rock you're going to make here are mudstones and shales. Why is that important? This is a low energy water environment, meaning the water velocity is extremely slow, if moving at all. So what happens is, as these organisms die, their biological material gets into this incredibly low energy environment and then sink to the bottom and get buried quickly. The end result can be this black layers that you see right here, which are coal. Coal is, it's a fuel, it's a fossil fuel. And it's a fossil fuel of this kind of stuff right here. So wherever we see a modern day swamp in geologic future, if the conditions were correct, it would create this right here. We can actually see that process happen in the modern tense. So whenever we find coal, we know that it was formed in this kind of environment right here. Lacustrine, say that with me, lacustrine. That refers to a lake. Lacustrine includes all non-marine water bodies that are not rivers. Okay. So this is a lacustrine environment. This is actually Lake Mead by Las Vegas. And really kind of a sad story. I might point out that this used to be the water level just like a decade and a half ago, and it's dropped that much. Lake Mead's in fear and in risk of going dry in our lifetime. That's really bad news for people out west, because it's a major source of energy for a hydropower dam, and it's a major drinking water resource. So in a lake, most of the time out in the middle of the lake, you have very low energy at the bottom of it. Around the edges, that may not be the case. You could actually have some pretty interesting larger grain rocks. So the rock type varies, but most of the time the rocks that settle out at the bottom of a lake are very fine grained, indicating that it was a low energy depositional environment. So you'll get siltstones and shales. So if you've ever been diving in a lake, you know that's really not the best diving after you've been in open water, right? Because it's just not as pretty. And you get down there and it's murky because of all the shale that's kind of suspended. And that's what a lacustrine environment is a lake. A glacial environment, well, you're like, duh, that's where glaciers are. May not be as obvious to you when the ice is not there. But glacial environments can make all size materials, from the biggest boulders that are bigger than a building all the way to flower textured siltstones. So it is a remarkable thing, and there's only one kind of environment that can create the landscapes that, for example, valley glaciers and continental glaciers can make. So you're looking at an active glacier at Mount Rainier. I went up there on my sabbatical and was just overwhelmed with the beauty of Mount Rainier. So if you ever get a chance to go to Washington State, that's on your must-go-to list. Trust me, you'll be glad you did. It's a great national park. But up there, people hike up to the top of Mount Rainier, and it's because it's an incredible hike and beautiful up there because they're active glaciers. So this is a special type of glacial feature. You'll be learning about those in Test 4. But if the ice disappears, you're going to see a really remarkable U-shaped profile. And it still tells me a glacier used to be there. Also, its deposits tell me a glacier used to be there. So glacial environments can only create some things that can be made no other way. And if you find them in an area that you're visiting or that you're studying, it's an automatic clue that a glacier used to be in the neighborhood. Another thing that glaciers can do is put lots and lots of deposits out there as they melt. This is braided streams from New Zealand. This came out of right where Milford Sound is and some of the really big Southern Alps that exist in New Zealand. So I was on a plane ride and took this when we flew over these braided streams, and I can tell you that this is very indicative of a glacial environment. So let's say I find deposits that look like this, even though this is modern, and let's say they're old lithified ancient ones that are 300 million years old. That would tell me that these deposits came from a melting glacier at some point from geologic past. Just a clue. All right, marine. Marine and the one for rivers are the two most variable of all the depositional environments, for the reason being there's so many different potential characteristics that could be available in a marine setting. Marine refers to anything that's saltwater that is like an ocean, a seaway, a lagoon, a shoreline like this right here. This is the green sand beach in South Point, Hawaii. And but I want to point out that you could have deposits being made right along the edge right here at the shoreline, or in the continental shelf that's several thousand kilometers deep. It could be down in the continental slope. We've learned about that already. Down at the flat bottoms of the ocean floor. Or you could have sediments that might get made around a MOR, very unlikely, mid-oceanic ridge. But nevertheless, the difference in depth between here and here is remarkably different, isn't it? Subsequently, the organisms that live there are going to be different as well. So you got to think about the pressure of water, what would do to fossils as little microscopic things that contain a little bit of oil in them while they're alive. They don't make it as well all the way down here. They kind of disintegrate. However, they accumulate really well right here. So it matters what we're talking about when we're talking about a marine environment. So we have to kind of subdivide where those marine environments are, so we're clearly discussing and identifying the correct depositional environment by which they're made. Let's start with the lagoon. I took this shot in a helicopter going over the Great Barrier Reef in Australia. And wow, this place was awesome. You really can't get the gist of how awesome the Great Barrier Reef is until you get on top of it by air. So if you go out there, I'm telling you, it's worth the money to pay to go see this, because you get it. You get what the Great Barrier Reef, it's like, it's several thousand coral reefs combined into one. Lagoons are shallow marine areas, and shallow to a geologist is different than probably what your definition is, but I'm going to really mean this is probably like your definition. Shallow marine can be anything that's 700 or so feet or less. In this case, you're looking at about 100 feet or less. You're like, that doesn't look like it's 100 feet. Well, in here it probably is. Right in here it's about 40 to 50. That's how clear the water is. But notice that it's protected by this, you see this surf right here? Literally, folks, this is about 50 miles from the shoreline. And this whole, everything from this point backwards looks like this right here. And so this is a barrier reef, and it's just so you know, the Great Barrier Reef is all kinds of coral reefs, but in this particular case, you're actually looking at a barrier reef that's protecting the shoreline, and then you see the reefs behind it. So this is a fairly quiet depositional environment back here, allowing for certain kinds of organisms to grow. Now this is the shoreline. I took this shot in Oregon on my sabbatical on the coastline on Highway 101. And you can totally see, this is the edge. I'm standing out here looking at the beach. And so there's a river that's flowing in, and this is high and low tide. You can see where the high tide had come in. So along the areas of where a continent erodes in its edges, the wave action can break up the continent, and rivers can bring in eroded material and deposit them here. So you get a combination of sediments. You get the eroded stuff that comes from life that's out in the ocean, like coral reefs, and then you get the eroded stuff that deposits from the terrestrial setting, all mixed together. So you get an interesting set of rocks. So most shorelines are made out of sand, and then you get to the near shore, you get to something that's going to be more silty. Then you get a little further out, you're probably going to make shale. Eventually you're going to get far away enough from this right here that you're going to produce something called limestone. We'll be getting into that in test 2, so more to come on that. Let's get to the other most diverse of the depositional environments, fluvial. F as in Frank, not P as in Paul. Why does that matter? There is such a geologic feature as a pluvial lake. That is actually a glacier feature, so more to come on that. So I want you to get the spelling right. Fluvial, F as in Frank, L-U-V-I-A-L. These refer to rivers. And rivers can be rapidly flowing like the one you see right here from Mount Rainier. And so that glacier I showed you a minute ago, it was right up here. And this is meltwater from those glaciers. Okay, and so you see the gigantic boulders all over this river here. That's a phenomenal amount of energy that can carry that. Some rivers just move turtle slow. So they're not going to carry the same size sediments that this particular river in Mount Rainier could do. So rivers are as variable as the strength of the flow, and that can change overnight for any river. We have rivers in the local area where I live in Waco that will change literally from being fairly slow flowing, and with a few inches of rain upstream, those things can be raging and rolling and jump their banks within just a few hours. So when I worked for the Brazos River Authority, I did water quality testing, and that was a problem during storm events. We could actually be in danger of drowning if we were in an area that mass wasted and we were sampling along banks of rivers because of that very problem. So rivers are as dynamically different as the flow changes for that river. When we look at a modern day river, like this is a regular meandering stream right here, it leaves deposits behind. So this is the modern river deposits. Here's ancient river deposits. A few clues I hope you can pick up on. First of all, what's the shape of the clast? You're like, well, they're rounded. Predominantly, yes. Another thing you might notice is they're kind of all tipped over the same direction. That tells us the flow of the direction of water. So we can determine a lot simply by looking at the ancient clasts that are in fluvial deposits or river deposits to help us determine the kind of energy that was present when those rocks were formed. This kind of rock layer should be wow clue. If you see some massive conglomerates like you see right here, that tells you point blank you've got some kind of flash flood event. You're not going to be able to carry rocks this size. That's a big boulder. These things are huge. And notice right above it, right up here, how the character of the rock radically changes and the clast size becomes a completely different category, like sands. So what I'm seeing is a sand layer here, a flood layer here. Do you see another sand layer right in here? And then a flood layer beneath it. I'm seeing inconsistent energy environments in that fluvial system where we have flow that's regular, then bam, we have some kind of flash flood, then flow, and bam, we have a flash flood. Now you look at these rocks differently once you've seen that. And once you know this information, you can't help but be changed, because you will never see rocks the same way once you have this type of information. So what kind of depositional environment created this amazing view in Glacier National Park? See if you can guess out of the names you just learned. It's a fluvial, that's correct. What kind of depositional environment would this be? So you're like, well, it's marine. It is. Well, let's get more specific. This is a coral reef, probably going to be in a lagoon setting. What kind of depositional environment is this? Well, I see mud cracks. It looks very dry. I happen to know exactly where this is. By the way, this picture was taken by Brad Turner, who is a professor here. And this is a desert environment. What's the name for a desert environment? It begins with an E. Aeolian. What kind of environment created this? Not only is it fluvial, it is flash flooding. What kind of depositional environment created this? I'm like, I don't know. What is that? Those are little tiny shells that are found along Shark Bay, Australia, right where those stromatolites were I showed you earlier. These have to be marine. And obviously they can't be too far from the coastline, so they're probably in a nearshore environment. What kind of depositional environment did this mammoth live in? Mammoth W. By the way, that's the prettiest mammoth at the mammoth site if you want to know that. Terrestrial is correct. And let's be a little bit more precise. She was probably hanging out under the trees at a water body like a fluvial system. And unfortunate to her, she got buried in a flood deposit. What a bummer, huh? What kind of environment created that kind of fossil? If you're like, I don't know yet, we haven't had fossils. Well, this is one that should stand out to you. Even the rock type can give it away, because we've learned about the rock type already in sedimentary rocks. That's limestone. And what kind of environment does limestone form in? Marine is the correct answer. What kind of depositional environment is this? Well, it's a river, so what do we call a river? Fluvial is correct. So what kind of depositional environment created this? Like, well, I see a river down at the bottom. I do too. That's not what created it. Look at this big, broad U-shaped valley with really steep sides right here and a steep side right here and a big, nice U at the bottom. There's only one geologic thing that can create that, and that's a glacier. So hopefully after seeing all of this, you have a new perspective. Yeah, I get it. This stuff is created in unique places. And when I see these in nature, whether they're ancient or present, I can understand a little bit more about how these rocks are made. That's the whole point of understanding geologic depositional environments. I will see you next time when we visit about metamorphic rocks. See you then. Bye.